Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yes po.
Yes, sir. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, thanks. Let's hear you. Let's wait for a few minutes. Okay, I think we can start. Is it recording, guys?
Yes
Yes
po.
po.
Okay, all right. So just some introduction, house rules. So again, I'm JF. Uh, I think all of you are already enrolled in the UVLE. So if you're not, or if you're not grouped, because I think all of the Econ 11 students are in one UVLE course, but you're grouped according to your discussion class. So if you don't see our particular Zoom meeting for the discussion class, please notify me. That means that uh, you're not in the discussion class group. So our section is TJ5, if I'm not mistaken. So if you have questions or concerns related to the course, you can reach me through my email. So just send an email, but just write Econ 11 and then TJ5 first, so that I could easily determine that it's Econ 11 related, and then and whatever the subject is of your email. So just put Econ 11 TJ5, and then for the main reference, you know it. Did any one of you guys uh, find it online? The text.
Yes, sir.
Okay, so that's accessible. Do you have questions about this? Um, the requirements for the course, or like reactions or concerns? Oh, there's a chat. None so far. Basta you understand naman clearly how your grades will be computed. As for the as for how the exams will be conducted, that's still up for discussion between Professor Mansot and the TFs. But we're making sure that it's going to be equitable. It's going to be fair for all of you because we have different situations. Um, does any one of you have any problems regarding internet accessibility, connection problems, something like that? Anyone? No problem. I mean, you guys have, do you guys have like good connection to the internet? If you get problems connecting, you can rewatch the lectures, even our discussion class. They will be posted in the yes. What's your name? What would I call you?
Ay, ako po, sir, so far, medyo mahina yung Wi-Fi, sir, pero manageable pa po.
Okay.
I'll just change my Zoom name na lang po. Thank you.
Okay, okay. Got it. So if ever you have problems, although attendance is encouraged, but it's not really required. So as for the participation grade, as long as you answer the exercises, uh, problem set, whatever it is that you're asked to answer, you'll be fine. You don't have to worry about it, even if you can't attend the discussion class. But it's encouraged. So it's important to attend. I mean, if you can, because that's where you get to ask questions or get to clarify some stuff. If you don't understand any the what was discussed, so just tell me if you get trouble accessing as well the files and whatnot. So my email's open. Schedule of exams. It's every Sunday. Not sure yet the time. I hope it's asynchronous because it's really hard to take synchronous exams, especially the you know inequitable situation that we're in. Not everyone has the same uh, working conditions. So we'll try our best to negotiate with ma'am about the way the exams will be conducted. But so far, these are the dates for the four exams. So you'll have four exams, but if you do well in these four exams, you can choose not to take the final exam, right? But if you need, well, you can still take the exam, but that if you take the final exam, that would be like a different scoring, like I mean, as stated in the syllabus. But there's no specific date yet for the final exam, but that's usually finals week. So that's according to the calendar. That's from January 10 to 18. But there's no specific date yet for Econ 11 in particular. All right. So do you guys have like questions regarding the lecture a while ago by Professor Munsod? Were there any confusing stuff or things that you feel that you need to? Uh, I mean, you don't get it at first. Do you guys have like questions about it? Nah. Okay. So I guess you're good with the lecture a while ago, but we'll still review. So can anyone remember how these terms were defined? Scarcity, efficiency, inputs and outputs. Uh, and can you like give certain examples? Anyone? Like do you I mean these were defined by Professor Mansod a while ago. So can anyone tell me like, based on your own understanding how how these are defined? Anyone? You can chat if you try to turn on your mic. Like scarcity. Yeah.
As far as I can remember, I think mom said something about it not necessarily having a definite or an exact meaning. Rather, it could be defined by something based on human needs or wants, or well, I believe it's a bit subjective to you and your group's desires, if I'm correct.
Mhm. Yeah. Well, so scarcity. Well, you're right when you say that it depends on the wants and needs uh, of a person or of a society. Like scarcity just means that it you have limited resources. So that's right. It really depends on what you want and how resources can meet those things that you want or things that you need. That's correct. So that's scarcity. So uh, there's in a, on Earth there's no, well, resources are, that's why we're instructed to conserve, right? Because resources are limited and resources can't fulfill every need and every want. So that's scarcity. How about efficiency? Anyone? Do you guys remember how this was defined or how you understood it? Anyone? Scarcity. How do you define? I'm sorry, efficiency. Yeah. Wenny, go ahead.
Sir.
Yeah, sure.
Um, okay, good afternoon, class. What I like about the earlier discussion lecture was how Professor Munshaw defined the efficiency, because basically it is the absence of waste, and we we are here to study the economics because as mentioned before earlier that we do have scarce resources, and we want to utilize those resources in the most effective and efficient manner. So thank you.
That's right. It's the absence of waste, meaning you're using your resources, which we will define later on. The resources or inputs, you're using them at their best use or enough to produce what your society or what your economy needs. Or we can bring it at the micro level, what you or I need. So that's efficiency. It means that you're employing your inputs, your goods and services to their proper use, so that everything will be accounted for, everything uh, will be consumed, and everything will be produced. So that's efficiency. That's correct. So inputs and outputs. Can anyone differentiate the two? Anyone? Efficient inputs and outputs. How? What's the difference between the two? Anyone? Uh, G. Do I call you G or
Yes, please. So inputs and outputs are basically this inputs muna. These are the products or things that are used in production. And then outputs, this is what basically results of what you made in production. So example of output is labor, but it's also an example of output.
yeah, right. It's good. It's good. Correct. So again, to repeat, inputs are goods and services that are used for production in order to produce outputs. So outputs are the goods and services that are used for perhaps further production processes or for consumption. So that's output. So you have to remember these terms because these are important in our later discussion, and especially the difference between inputs and outputs, so that you won't uh, get confused later on. So I guess this was defined by Professor Monsod. So basically, economics is the study of how society manages its scarce resources. So when you say manage, that could pertain to choosing. So that's the first emphasized word. Yeah, I agree. It's true. So we'll get to that capital, what Andrea said. But when we say managing, so it's choosing and then producing and distributing. So you're trying to choose which to produce, right? Given the resources that we have, and then you also decide what to produce and then how you will distribute them. Because remember, that boils down to the uh, two themes of economics. That's efficiency and scarcity, right? So let's move further along. Oops. This was already discussed earlier. So remember, um, we need to balance unlimited wants and needs versus uh, the current resources at hand. That's the fundamental problem that economics is trying to is trying to address rather. And but remember, scarcity necessitates making a choice. So it's all about choosing. So what's the best choice then? So the criteria in answering that question is efficiency. Right? So in economics language, efficiency is producing efficiently when it cannot make anyone economically better off without making someone else worse off. So, in understanding this, remember that efficiency, you're using up resources at its best, or you're maximizing the resource that you have. So, remember what was said earlier, there's no waste. So, let's say, uh, recall, well, it's not really a good example. Let's say the earlier example is guns and butter, right? So it well, we'll talk about further why that was represented. But guns and butters, for instance, the economy has produces only those two goods, two types of goods. So if you're efficiently producing, that means you're along the curve, right? You're maximizing your inputs and your technology to produce at maximum those two goods. Now, what we when we say that when it this where my pointer is, this definition, when we say this, that means when you have to something takes something away from producing a gun so that you can increase production of butter, and then vice versa, right? Because you're using it at maximum, there's no waste. That's why there would be someone worse off, so to speak, right? So this was already mentioned by Professor Mansod. So three problems of economic organization, or questions that central questions or issues that the economics field faces. So one, what to produce, what commodities are produced, and in what quantities. And second, how to produce them, who will do the production, with what resources, and what production technology will be used. And lastly, for whom are goods produced, who gets to eat the fruit of economic activity, is the distribution of income and wealth fair and equitable. So you have to know that even if you're using your resources efficiently, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's fair and equitable. So you can have efficient production, but um, only the rich gets most of gets to consume most of what's produced. So that could happen. So we don't equate efficiency with equity. So those two are different and they're distinguished. But we can achieve we can achieve both, but we have to base it on some normative, or base it on some value judgment, like what is fair, right? But then you can um, like later on, when we say, for instance, the economy, remember there was a graph earlier about uh, public goods, private goods. I think we'll talk more about public goods later on, but essentially public goods are goods that are for everyone. Yeah, who's raising their hand? G or Wenny? Sorry, are you raising your hand?
Oh, sorry, I forgot to lower my.
Okay, all right. So public goods are free, and they're not produced by private organizations, right? They're produced by the government, and they're free for everyone to consume, right? So that means public goods are really well, they're not free per se, because they're they're funded by taxes, right? But who pays? Of course, um, who pays more but benefits less? Of course, those who are, um, you know, um, the higher income groups. But those who benefit more but pay less because they have less income, those less income groups. So between those, if you plot the PPF will dig deeper on the graphing part, but if you plot it, so my x-axis is public goods, my y-axis is private goods. So you can also see that there's a trade-off, or which we'll later discuss. And we will see like the trade-off between equity and efficiency. So this was discussed as well, major branches, micro and macro. Micro is the study of households and firms. So households and firms, when I say households and firms, these are like economic units or economic actors or agents. They are the unit of analysis of microeconomics. And micro deals in studying how they interact and so on. And they are the building block. It said that they're the building block of macro. And macro, on the other hand, you just have to remember that it's aggregate. So micro can talk about one market. So that's the interaction of households and firms, which we'll discuss later on. Uh, and then if you aggregate more than one market, two, three, four, five, and so on and so forth, that's the macroeconomics. So you're studying economy-wide phenomena, including inflation, unemployment, economic growth. And in the latter part of the semester, Professor Monsad will discuss about growth and business cycle. And these are part of issues that are addressed by macroeconomics. So now, the economist is a scientist. We all know that economics is a social science, but the approach, well, of course, I think other social sciences also use is a scientific method. Basically, it's just observation, making observations and making out hypotheses or theories out of those observations. So that's a scientific method. So, for example, as you see here, rapidly increasing prices might be observed in a country, whereas which leads the economists to develop a theory of inflation. So this theory might assert that printing too much money causes high inflation. So that's increasing price. The theory might assert that printing too much money causes high inflation. So to test this theory, the economist could collect and analyze data on prices and money from different countries. So if growth in the quantity of money were completely unrelated to inflation, he or she would start to doubt the validity of his or her theory. If money growth and inflation were found to be related in the data, the economist would become more confident in the theory. So economists also use natural experiments. When we say natural experiments, these are outcomes or effects that are born out of historical events or episodes, maybe man-made or natural. So for example, wars, calamities, and then of course we can analyze the outcomes. For instance, during the um, 70s, there was an oil shock, oil price shock. So because there was ano ba, like we'll, we'll talk about that. So economists would study those outcomes, events, and then they would gather meaningful data out of it. Right. So economists also employ models. So this is what the first model that we've learned is a PPF. They simplify the complex world. So remember what Professor Moon saw, the caveat. The PPF only shows two goods, but in reality, there are more than two goods. But we want to make clear of the insights or the details that we want to see. So we don't we don't incorporate everything because that would make things more confusing. So what economists would do would they would employ models, or these are representations through diagrams or equations to see how things are, how things behave. So they make assumptions, and in the PPF we see that it was assumed that there are two goods. So that's an assumption. They simplify the complex world, and it's really more of an art, making assumptions, right? Because although there would be some basis for it, but sometimes you just have to uh, be discerning of what to assume, or be reasonable about your assumptions in, so that you can understand more of the complex world that you're studying. So here, let's just focus on the examples. This was discussed earlier by Professor Mansod. So for the post hoc fallacy, remember, I'll just make a, uh, this is when we assume that because one event occurred before another event, the first event caused the second event. But it's not necessarily the case, because there could be other factors that could explain why the second event occurred. So example, the rooster crows immediately before sunrise. Therefore, the rooster causes the sun to rise. So that's not the case. That's not necessarily the case. There are other things that causes the sun to rise. Uh, and then we have the failure to hold other things constant. So again, it all boils down to considering other factors or events uh, that might explain what has caused an event. So here, for instance, when you want to analyze, like for instance, the impact of, COVID-19, the impact of COVID-19 to, prices, uh, there are other things to consider in explaining why prices behave as such. So you need, if you want to explain, you need to hold other things constant. You have to consider that. So in economics, there's this phrase called ceteris paribus, or all other things being equal. So you don't make generalizations, because, for instance, if you want to claim something, right, based on an observation, uh, that's just a hypothesis. You have to validate it with facts, with data, right? So you hold other things constant. So you could just read the example there. And lastly, the fallacy of composition. So you assume that what is true for the part is also true for the uh, whole. So for instance, if you cut in line, you can order your food faster. Therefore, everyone should cut in line so that everyone can order their food faster, which is not true, because everyone would just congest and it would make the queue worse, right? Worse. Or here, another example of the fallacy of composition. Of course, we know that savings uh, would allow us to spend more, but if everyone saves more, uh, national income, we'll talk about that in macro, will decline, because a part of economic activity that is calculated is consumption in the aggregate, right? So if everyone saves in the aggregate, then economic activity will decline, or national income will decline. So this was also talked about. So positive economics, that's a frame of thinking in which uh, it's a question of fact, versus normative economics, a question of fairness, or it causes you to use value judgment, right? So what is versus what should be. So positive is like, it's just based on observation. This is what's going on. Normative, this should be done because, and then you have like some basis why it should be done. So example, for normative economics, for instance, the first bullet, if the government wishes to restrict the importation of oil in a way that's least costly to the government and consumers, tariffs are preferable than quotas. So just to define some stuff, tariff is a government-imposed trade restriction that levies taxes on a particular class of imports or exports, while tariffs are volume restrictions, meaning the amount or quantity that can be exported or imported are restricted. So that's a normative statement because what's your basis for saying that tariffs should be preferable to quotas, right? I could say quotas can be preferable to tariffs. So that involves value judgment, right? And then the second statement is the government should raise the minimum wage. That's a question of what should be, because you're prescribing. It's not really a question of fact, meaning like you don't observe it because it could be from your observation, it could be that you get to conclude or say that the government should not raise the minimum wage, right? That's a question that involves value judgment. So in contrast, a positive statement will be for the first one, the imposition of quotas on oil in the 50s led to higher domestic prices and the more rapid depletion of our natural resources. That's a question of fact. That's based on observation. That's based on what's happening as you see it. And then minimum wage laws cause unemployment. That's a phenomenon as well, and that has been observed. That's validated by data. So it really depends. So positive economics, what is? So remember that. Normative economics, what should be. Those are just like shorthand way of remembering. So you could just. So now let's go to the analysis or the production possibility frontier. So the PPF, it's a model, it's a tool that shows maximum amounts of production of outputs that can be obtained by an economy given its technology and quantity of input. So remember what the PPF is showing is the combination of outputs. So remember the distinction between inputs and outputs. Output, so what is produced. And in the background of the PPF is the inputs and technology that an economy or society has. Okay? So we know that inputs could be, well, could be divided into that land, labor, and capital. And then Andrea mentioned how capital can be both an input and output. How so? Because for instance, capital goods, it's used for as an input for producing, let's say, capital goods. An example, let me think. I guess like infrastructure, right? So that's needed so that goods and services can be transported, delivered, and consumed by the market, right? And as well as it could be an output because like infrastructure, mm, well, it could be bought, right? It could be bought by firms. It could be bought by, the government as well, right? So that's why capital can be both input and output. So the PPF can be used to illustrate the following concept. So we've talked about efficiency. So along the curve, so we'll see later a graph, or if you remember the graph of Professor Munsod, along that curve is the efficient use of inputs to produce outputs, a combination of outputs. So that's efficiency. So the PPF also illustrates trade-offs and opportunity costs. So remember, if you move along, you have to take away something from the production of one good to increase the production of the other good. So remember guns and butter example, that's a classic example of Professor Munsod, and also in the book in Samuelson. guns and butter. So if you want to increase the production of guns or military goods, you need to take away resources or inputs from producing uh, butter or agricultural goods, right? So and then you move along that curve. So I'll show that later on. That's because uh, goods and services are scarce, right? So that's why there's trade off. And then opportunity cost, you have to remember that's not monetary value, but that's the value in terms of the other good. The value forgone when you sacrifice a particular good so that you can produce the other good. So then inefficiency, so that's when the economy or the society is within the curve, not along the curve, but within, meaning that there are unemployed resources. And then we also have unattainable or infeasible points that's outside the curve, meaning your resources are not enough to produce that particular good. And also the PPF can show economic growth. So that's pushing the PPF outward. So can anyone tell me what the points represent? A, B, C, D, E. Anyone? Uh, I mean, based on what we've discussed so far, what can you say about points A, B, C, D, and E? Anyone?
Oh,
No one?
sir, I can try po.
Go ahead, Naomi.
For A po, A and B, aren't they like the trade-offs with maximum amount of warships produced, then zero amount of grains produced, and vice versa? And then D is for it shows inefficiency po. For C, it's efficient. For A, C, and B, since they're along the curves po, so it would
That's
be
right.
an efficient naman po. And then E, it's basically the unattainable point.
Okay, very good. So you're right. Points A, B, and C are efficient points because they're along the curve, meaning that you're you're maximizing production of goods and services given your inputs and given your inputs and technology, right? So you're here. This is still an efficient point, but here you're producing all you're using up your inputs to produce warships and zero grains. And here you're using your inputs to produce grains, all grains but no warships. They're just extreme values, but in effect they're still efficient production. But here you're right, D is inefficient. Why? Because there are unemployed resources. There's no uh, there's waste in effect, because here you could actually um, increase both. Remember how we defined efficiency as well. It's making someone or something better off while making someone or something worse off. Okay. I mean, if you're producing efficiently, if you can if you make someone better off while making someone something worse off, something like, because you've maximized everything, so you have to remove resources from that part of production to increase or do something about the other production. So here in point D, there's waste because you're not using it at it, you're not maximizing it. You can increase going here or going here, right? And here, yes, this is unattainable because this is the limit of your inputs and technology. So very good. So now the PPF can also show trade-offs and opportunity costs. So trade-off is choosing to produce or consume one thing entails giving up another thing. That's because um, resources again are limited. So just remember the basic concepts: scarcity, efficiency, inputs and outputs. So there will be a trade-off, right? Resources are limited. Uh, but in the time of COVID, there's been a debate, right? They say that there's a trade-off between health and economy, but me personally, I disagree with that, and many economists also disagree with that statement because I think that, well, they're not really understanding what the trade-off is, right? And they're separating health and economy. So, but that's a different, more deep conversation. But basically, uh, when we when we talk about economy in terms of production, consumption, there's always a trade-off because our resources are really limited. You can't, as mentioned earlier, you can't use use up everything for a particular good. Parang the others being neglected or something like that. So the value, on the other hand, of the trade-off, or the value of what you gave up in order to gain something else, is called opportunity cost. So that's not in monetary values. So just take note of that. But that's in terms of the goods, of the particular good that was sacrificed in order to gain something of the other good. So for instance here, if you want to increase the production of grains or the production of agriculture, the opportunity cost is how much warships can be reduced, can be given up so that you can increase grains. So that's basically opportunity cost in economics speak. So here, let's just put a bit of numbers so that we could get a deeper understanding. Uh, so we have here computers and cars. So when the economy moves from point A to point B, here in the graph, A to B, society produces 100 more cars, so 700 minus 600, at the expense of producing 200 fewer cars. So 2,000. So this is your new value, right? 2,000 minus 2,200. So the opportunity cost of 100 cars here to gaining 100 cars is 200 computers. So that's the opportunity cost. So notice that the opportunity cost is measured as the slope of the PPF. So there was a question earlier in the discussion class: are the numbers or the figures arbitrary, or how they're generated? Just remember, when generating these figures, for instance, well, you could have like different representations of the numbers. This could be more than 3,000 or less than 3,000. This could be more than 1,000. It just depends. No, these are just like they're arbitrary in the sense that these numbers represent something. I mean, they're not, represent like well, they're just there to basta they're not they're but they have to be consistent with arithmetic, with algebra. Just remember your basic algebra, your slope, rise over run, and then how to draw a line and a quadrant and all those. Besides, just has to be consistent with the math. You can represent it by 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in both axes, and so on and so forth. But remember that the opportunity cost is measured as the slope of the PBF. In this case, this is concave to the origin. So this is not a constant slope. You can have different slopes here. So the line tangent to F, is different. The slope of that is different from the line tangent to A, to B, to E. So those are slopes, right? But if you have like a linear graph, so that represents a uh, linear slope, right? So here, more on the opportunity cost. So the opportunity cost of a car is highest when the economy is producing many cars and few computers here. Because let's say, for instance, if you move from B to E, you take away so much production of computers and you give it up and to produce more cars. And then when the economy is producing few cars and many computers here, the opportunity cost is lower. So you could just, I mean, if it's easier for you to use math, you could just compare the slopes, right? So this is flatter slope. And then when you draw a line here, tangent to E, that's you know, more steep, a steeper slope. Just tell me if you have questions or, you know, it's becoming more confusing. So here, if you want to compute the opportunity cost of producing a car, so your opportunity cost, remember, it represents the value or the value for gun, right? So this is just a slope computations. Why is this negative? Because remember y over x, right? So this is your y-axis, x-axis. So your remember y sub 2 minus y sub 1, your and all over x sub 2 minus x sub 1. That's how you solve the slope, right? Uh, so your this is your previous or your old value, right? And this is your new value. So this is your, let's say this is your y sub 2 and this is your y sub 1. So you just subtract them. So that's negative. And then here, that's the same. And then you get to compute for the opportunity cost. So here's the inverse cost. Remember, it's y over x, but in this case, it's your x-axis is cars. Your y-axis represents quantity of computers. So you just inverse if you're being asked the opportunity cost of producing the other good. So the nature, I've told you, if it's linear graph, so that's a constant. No, the opportunity cost is constant along every point. And then if it's concave, that's increasing. So how can the PPF shift outward? Again, so let's review. Remember, the PPF shows you outputs, right? Your x-axis, y-axis, those are outputs. Guns and butter, warships and grains, you know, the previous examples. But behind or at the background of the PPF is the resource or are the resources or the inputs used to produce those two goods. So if there are changes in input or in resources and technology, then the PPF could shift outward or inward depending what its effect is the uh, on the um, on the economy, on the resources and technology. So we have here again guns and butter. So there's a shift outward if in both ways. That's called a neutral technology change if there's no what we call specialization. So technology can be used either for butter or guns. So there's no bias or there's no specialization. So both it would increase A to C. It will go from A to C and B to D. So that would go outward. But this shows a pivot or a biased shift, meaning that if, for instance, the technology is only or the resources are devoted to making butter alone, then that would only be affected, the production of butter, but not the production of guns. That's why this remains the same, but here B shifts to C. So let's try a number of examples. Can anyone tell? So suppose that the economy is currently producing military defense and rice. So for each of the following, you could just describe what would happen to the PPF. So would it shift? Would it stay on this stay, or would the point go inward or outward? Whatever it is, just describe. So can anyone tell me number one? Anyone? The effect of an increase in the number of adult immigrants to the Philippines from other countries. Anyone? What? How would you describe the PPF? Like, let's say your PPF is like this, and then imagine whatever it is. So what would happen to the PPF? Anyone? Number of adult immigrants. So remember input, outputs. What's on the axis? What's on the axis are outputs. What's on the background of the entire graph are inputs and technology. So in this case, number one, what do you think would happen to the PPF? Anyone? Oh, there's a chat. So Iana said increase. All right, so that's good. The PPF will shift um, outside. Will shift outward because why do you think so? What do adult immigrants represent? Anyone? Remember your inputs? They could be classified as land, labor, and capital. Right? Adult immigrants represent an influx of labor. So that's correct. Let's say the PPF will shift because remember the movement, this will happen. And that's not biased, remember, because, it doesn't specify what the skills are of these adult immigrants, right? So that's a neutral shift outward. So yes, very good, very good. Yeah. Next, number two. Uh, show the effect of an increase or describe the effect of an increase in the percentage of workers who are unemployed. What do you guys think? Uh, Kirsten, why do you think so? Why would it shift?
Unemployment portrays or means that there would be lesser amount of labor. So basically, it would affect the graph and it will decrease the it will shift inward.
Okay, so let's define the labor force now. If you're unemployed, I will uh well TSA and other statistical organizations would describe labor force as the combination, well, as the sum of the employed and unemployed. So if people become unemployed, do you think they're out of the labor force?
Is it possible na ano lang sila, yung mga unemployed would be considered as non-utilized na labor force or
Well, yeah, okay, correct. I mean, that term, non-utilized. But are they outside? Will that decrease the number of labor force if they get unemployed? I mean, based on what I said na earlier na labor force is the sum of, well, in the basic sense, it's the sum of employed and unemployed. But di ba, remember, if you're out of labor force, I think here in the Philippines, if you're out of the you're considered in the labor force if you're 15 and above, and then there are other conditions. And then if you're below that, and then if you're 65 and above, you're not part of the labor force. But I guess yung what Patricia said, non-utilized, or it's not utilized. So it would still be the same, but the point, you're in an efficient point. So you're inside because there's labor is not utilized. Okay, there's some people that are not working, but they're still part of the labor force. So that doesn't diminish the number of labor force. So compared to the first is uh, an increase in the number of adult immigrants. So they're included adult. So that could mean between, yes, when.
Sir, yes, I agree. Na hindi sila mawawala sa labor force. Though, when it comes to statistic, there should be, or there would be probably decline. Katulad po sa goods po, 'di ba po yung goods, if it's unutilized, then there is this underconsumption po. So ayun po, sir.
Mm. Yeah, okay, wait. I think, let me clarify. So yung, when we say yung efficiency that's being referred here is production. I'm not sure. There's no such thing as efficient consumption. I think kasi allocate. Yeah, I think the focus of the efficiency here is production side. So that's correct. Labor force, so diminishing. But you could still but you're moving, diba? You're moving inside the curve because remember, goods and outputs yung x and y axis, but on the background yung input, or labor, land, capital. So there's no shift kasi the PPF will represent production production, diba? Efficient production. Walang shift, but the point where the economy is inside the curve. Is it possible na it will not? Yes, yun nga. So that's number two. So it's possible that there's no shift to the PPF, but yung point, kasi yung, remember the X and Y axis, yung combination, let's go back to the curve. So for here, lahat ng points, wherever it is, kahit nandito, mga combination of outputs. So kunyari, yung kanina, yung labor force na dumami yung unemployed. So, you can be here, di ba? Ibig sabihin, nabawasan yung inputs mo to produce goods and services. If it's not specialized, I mean, if it's just a general statement na unemployed people. So, hindi mo na utilize. So, hindi ka dito. So, may waste. It's not efficient. Non-utilized. Okay, go ahead. If you have class, you can go now. Sorry. I'll just wrap up in a minute. Okay, so, yeah. How about 3? Yes, when? Are you raising your hand? Yes. Go ahead. Okay, no one's raising. So 3, effect of the major earthquake. So remember, in this scenario, we're producing defense and rice. So what do you guys think? major earthquake, what's the effect on the economy? So remember, if it's an earthquake, that could affect the fertile lands, right? Say it's a major earthquake, so that could reduce land, the use of land for producing rice. So that's a shift inwards. And then lastly, for threat of war, let's say from, kasi that's long ago, from China leads Duterte to increase the size of armed force, but he doesn't really care about that. Pero let's say that's the case. The answer there is there's only a movement because you're taking away production, or you're taking away inputs from producing rice, and then you're enlisting them to the armed forces. Ayan. Will it shift more on the production? Biased. Yeah, if pwede, there's a biased inward change. Kunyari, like, yung technology or yung input is only used for yung nabawas, or yung na-affect is yung, for instance, producing rice, yung mga inputs doon. So let's say land, or yung mga farm workers and all that na-affect sila. That could cause a pivot inwards. Yeah, that's correct. Okay. So, meron pa dito, I think last na lang. Pero before I continue, na itong last example, kasi marami pa, magpapa-homework na lang siguro ako, and then you could just submit I'll send the, like, what you will answer, but that's not for the entire Econ 11 kasi may props pa. It's just for exercise, So parang participation lang. And then I'll send it later, and then email nyo sa akin by Thursday. So para by Thursday mabigay ko yung slides kasi nandito rin yung answers. Pero let's just discuss one last thing. So Econoland. So let's say that the Econoland produces haircuts and shirts which with inputs of labor. So the Econoland has 1,000 hours of labor available. A haircut requires 1/2 hours of labor, while a shirt requires 5 hours of labor. So let's try to construct the PBF. So your input, you have 1,000 hours of labor, and the outputs are haircuts and shirts. So how is that solved? So let's say that X is the number of haircuts, and L sub X is the labor hours required to do a haircut, Y is the number of shirts, and L sub Y is the labor hours required to produce a shirt. So that's basically this. You can represent it in a simple equation, right? Because hours times the number of haircuts plus hours of required to produce a shirt times Y. So that's equal to 1,000, the available hours of labor of that particular society. Or equivalently, because we've specified it, we could represent it through a simple linear equation. So recall that. So let's see. So here, so I think you start with the extreme values. Remember, if you're producing 0 haircuts and all the shirts, the labor hours are used to producing shirt. So if 0 haircuts, 0 haircuts, ayan. So you just compute for it, and then you'll get 200. And then for if you're using up all your labor hours in producing haircuts and 0 shirts, yeah, you'll get these. And then for the intermediate values, actually this is, well, it's arbitrary per se kasi you can, as long as you satisfy this equation, so it's a combination of X and Y, of haircuts and shirts. As long as that satisfies 1,000, then you can graph. So this is just like arbitrary, well, for yung dito sa example na to, pero pwedeng like may decimal place, pwedeng mag-iba to as long, again, as this is satisfied. So that's how you create the PPF. So if eto for ano lang homework or para for exercise, do you guys have questions or concerns before we end the class? Anyone? By the way, um, we have separate Zoom links for the lecture class and the discussion class. So the lecture class is every Tuesday and Thursday, 10 to 11, and our discussion class is every Tuesday only. So don't be confused about the links. You could check the UVLE or the emails. Basta lecture class, that's for 2 days, Tuesday and Thursday, and discussion class every Tuesday. Okay, so if you don't have any more questions, you could just email me if you have concerns about accessibility. So I'll send the rest of the exercise so you could do it at home. It's just like, parang participation or something. It's not really like you. Pero I'll see, and then we'll discuss the answers para you get to know what the answers are. Pero it's good to exercise, to have exercises so you get to understand the concepts better. Yeah, it's okay. The recording naman will be posted, so just watch it. So okay, so if you don't have any questions, so thanks for coming, guys. So see you on the lecture class 10 to 11. And then if you have further questions, if you don't understand, just email me. I'll try to my best to answer. So yeah. All right. See you guys. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank
Thank you,
you,
sir. Thank
sir.
you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Bye.